Welcome to the Solo Coder Podcast, where we talk shop with coders on how to start, change, and improve your coding career. Here is your host, Aderson Oliveira.
I spoke with Joe Eames. Joe is an educator with over 20 courses published on plural sites. When you look at his courses, you will quickly realize that Joe focuses a lot on test-driven development and Angular. He has also acquired Thinkster a few years back, which is a learning site with courses on front-end development. Joe loves putting together tech events, and he is one of the original ng-conf organizers. ng-conf is the most well-known Angular conference, and at the time, there was no conference like that in the Angular space. We have explored a bit the challenges of putting together an event like that. Joe also mentioned that nowadays he is a sales with a friend. They are helping clients with extended support for an older version of Angular called AngularJS. All in all, I just had a great time talking to the super nice Joe Eames. Listen to this conversation to understand why Joe says that the things that you don't get paid for are the ones most valuable to you. Enjoy the chat. And if you like the podcast and want to help, leave a comment, leave a review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast player. It will make a huge difference. Hello, Aderson Oliveira here. This is a Solo Coder Podcast, where I have amazing conversations with coders, developers, programmers. Call them however you want, but they have one thing in common. They have the love for coding as a big part of their lives, as a big part of their professions. And today is no different. Today I have with me Joe Eames. Joe, can you please introduce yourself and welcome? Today I have with me Joe Eames. Joe, can you please introduce yourself and welcome?
Hello, thank you for having me on. I'm really excited to be on this podcast. It's fantastic. I'm excited to be here and chatting with you. My name's Joe Eames. I am a developer. I've been developing now since, the mid-90s, so 25, 26, 27 years, something like that. Although my career has definitely jumped around. I've done a lot of different things, but always with the core of programming. So I've done so many things. I do a lot of front end stuff and a lot of entrepreneurial stuff nowadays and a lot of education. But I don't even have one of those great titles like, senior front end coder or anything like that, because I just do so many things.
I get it. Sometimes I get myself, okay, how do I define myself? So I get myself, okay, how do I define myself? So it's hard to put constraints, on how we define ourselves.
Yes.
Okay, so Joe, I usually like to start by bringing my guest, my hero, you are my hero here, to the origin stories. So What got you into coding?
Oof. It's such a great question to look back on your life and think, what was it that really, happened? There was quite a few events when I was a very young teenager. My sister did some coding in BASIC, the line numbers type of BASIC and go-to BASIC. And I remember watching her doing this. She never ended up doing any other coding than that, but she had this coding program on a computer that we had that she'd figured out, and she just did it for fun. But that isn't what the direction her career took. So I remember watching her, but I didn't call that coding at the time. And then when I was in the final stages of high school, in those final few years of primary school, I was really thinking about my career, and I had this idea that I was going to. I remember a very large book. So this was back before the internet, of course. This is the early 90s. And everything was out of books at that time. So there was this very large book of all the careers that a person could have. And the career counselors used to talk to you about what would your career be. And I remember looking through that thing, and I loved computers. I loved computer games. And so I remember looking through this book, and I found this idea. I wanted to go to MIT. That was my dream, was to attend the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and get some advanced degree in something. And I had this idea of the best career, the thing that looked the most complex and difficult as far as computers, was really like a server maintenance technician. And I remember being on a trip And I was speaking with this individual, and he says, if you're going to go to MIT, you could be the person that builds computers. And boy, I really remember the feeling in my heart as he said, he opened up my world really to just, go be the person who creates things, not just make sure that they're running, you know? And then somewhere from there, I got a job where there was a mail delivery at the local university. We were delivering mail. We were doing the Federal Express deliveries at the local university. And at that job, there was a little database that we would use in an old language called DBase. It's not very popular anymore. Have you heard of this?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. So we had a guy there who did a little bit of programming, and I started playing around with it. And then I started taking some classes and got to take a couple of programming classes. And I remember how much when I finally took my first programming class, I thought it was almost as I wasn't doing either the things that I thought that I loved. I loved math and physics, but when I finally got to program, it was like the world had opened up to me. So I think the real thing that got me into programming, though, was that I was playing Dungeons and Dragons a lot at the time with my friends when I was 16 and 17. And when I could learn to code, I started writing a program that would help me as we played Dungeons and Dragons. And that just drove me to continue to code. And I was taking a course at the university, and the course was 3 months long, and I think I was 3 weeks into the course when I had finished the book because I couldn't wait to just get through and learn more stuff. I think that was the moment that really got me into coding.
Got it. And did you end up going to computer science graduation or something like that?
No, I ultimately after that, I think I only took 2 more programming classes, and I took a couple of years off of school, a couple of gap years, you might call them, um, and did some humanitarian service. And when I returned from that, I came back home and I got a job, and I just was very lucky. I was planning to go to university, but I was very lucky that I had this opportunity. My manager had another manager approach him and say, I need another programmer. I've got one, but I need another one. Do you have one I can borrow for a little while? And my manager said, no, I can't spare any of mine, but I have this guy that we hired, and he doesn't really, we aren't utilizing him well. And I know that he said he'd taken some programming courses. So if you want to borrow him, you can borrow him. And again, this is before the internet still. This was 96. So technically the internet existed at this point, but not in the way that we know it today. And so programming was all learned out of books. And the guy came up to me and he handed me these 3 big, huge, thick books in FoxPro. Have you ever heard of FoxPro?
Yes, all of that. I mean, I'm in back 90s as well, you know.
Popular language back then. So
I'm in back 90s as well, you know.
Popular language back then. So he handed me these books for FoxPro, and it was a 3-day weekend. I can't remember which holiday it was, but he handed me those books and he says, if you can do this when the weekend's over, then I want you to come and work for me and do some programming for me. And so that whole weekend, all I did was I sat and just read those books the whole weekend. And I wouldn't say that I could do it when I came back, but I could do it well enough that he kept me on, and I got to this programming job.
No computer degree there. Have you ever missed the fact that I don't have the degree, so I cannot do X, Y, and Z? Did that ever happen to you?
Only once. Right around 2012, I wanted to get a job at Google because I wanted to join the Angular team. They wanted me to apply, they wanted me to join the team, but I had to pass the engineering interview. And at that time, all the programming jobs that would involve working on the Angular team were only under the categorization of engineering. And at Google, they only have they just have basically this one programming title, and you have to pass the interview because for them at Google, if you decide you don't like where you're at, you might move and go over and work on search or maps or whatever. So they needed these very robust engineers that knew a lot of the difficult fundamentals of computer science. And so when I took that first interview, I did a little bit of brushing up on my data structures and algorithms, but I really failed that interview. And so I did get a second interview 6 months later, and I spent that entire 6 months really studying hard data structures and algorithms, but that would probably be the only time I really did miss not having a degree. Other than that, it didn't seem to affect me at all. In fact, I mostly think it was a better choice for me to not have the degree because I was just farther along.
But the problem there with Google is not
Grammar, that's all I had done. Data structures and algorithms you don't encounter them very often.
true.
Now and then, and I had this sort of surface level exposure and understanding of them, but it was that knowledge that Google didn't care about. No place that I've been to that I can remember or even looked at, obviously no place I got hired at, but actually truly required a degree. But the knowledge, a degree is absolutely valuable, very valuable. For one thing, it's the best way to get into the industry. There are other ways to get into the industry, but none of them are nearly as safe of a way to get in. I worked a lot with those boot camps, these, come and learn web programming boot camps in 3 months. And I know that the numbers are 2/3 to 3/4 of the students they go back to whatever they were doing before, but they don't get into the industry and become programmers. So, and that's not true of university graduates, computer science university graduates. The numbers are much better. Still very valuable, but yeah, that knowledge I did miss. Still very valuable, but yeah, that knowledge I did miss that knowledge, and I would love to one day go back and actually go get a degree just for fun.
Okay, so you mentioned there about boot camps, and I also see in your profile you define yourself as an educator as well. So when did you make the jump to consider yourself an educator?
I always loved having the opportunity to teach other people, and so through maybe the starting into the second decade of my career, after about 8 or 10 years, I did a lot of attending meetups, and I did a little bit of speaking and presenting at just corporate, company lunch and learns where, the 10 people on the team, we'd get together at lunch once a week, and one of us would present something to the group. And I really enjoyed doing that, but right about 2011, I was at a meetup. Back then, we didn't call them meetups, right? We called them user groups.
User groups, yes.
Yep. Nowadays, meetup has redefined the term, but I was at a user group, and I was sitting next to the CTO of Pluralsight, and I was a subscriber to Pluralsight, learning things from them. And I told the CTO, I said, "Man, you got a great site. You have a lot of great content, but you really need a course on this topic." And I think it was testing in JavaScript. And he said, "Well, that's a great idea. Why don't you come build the course for us?"
Wow.
And I said, "Fine, I will." And that sort of really shifted my career. And within 2 years, I was a full-time author for Pluralsight, authoring courses online. And then a few years ago, I actually purchased an existing online educational company and ran that for a couple of years. So that was really kind of the beginning of the shift. About that same time, I started doing a lot of speaking at conferences and presenting at conferences, and that was really kind of when I shifted into being more of an educator than just purely a coder.
Go back to that point in time, Joe, that you got this invitation to put together this course and you have never done this.
Mm-hmm.
Did ever the thought of, can I really do this, came to your mind, cross your mind at all?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. When my training was not, at the time, they were a very young company, very small company. And so the training at the time really was non-existent. They had a lot of other authors who were people who had done a lot of book writing. And so as they had gotten into video authoring, maybe they just had a stronger educational background. But my training consisted entirely of my point of contact, project manager sort of person who said, "Go and watch another author that you like and then just try to replicate what they do." And so I went, and one of my favorite authors was a man named Dan Wallin. Are you familiar with that name?
Yes.
Dan is an amazing individual, and now a good friend of mine, although back then I didn't know Dan personally. But I had followed him. I really enjoyed his stuff, and so I started watching one of his courses, and then I tried to replicate it myself. And Dan is this robust, he just speaks and he talks, and he's fun and engaging. And on these courses, he just sat there and just chatted and talked and rattled off this stuff. And I tried to do the same thing, and it was just absolutely terrible. And I went back to the person at Pluralsight, that project manager, and I said, "I can't do this. I've been listening to this course about this, Dan Moline doing this, and just the way that he talks is cowboy is maybe the best word for it. He says, that's the wrong one. And he found this other author, and I can't even remember the name of the other author. He says, listen to this guy and see if you can follow him. So I did that. I listened to this other author, and the other author was much different, but more measured tone and pace. And he had, pauses in his speaking as he coded and displayed things. And that gave me more confidence to say, oh, I don't have to be this kind of a person to do this job. I can do this job and be this kind of a person. And I ended up finding that I actually liked that other presentation style better, but it gave me the confidence to continue forward. And yeah, 3 months of working 20 hours a week at night after my day job, working on that course before it finally got finished.
Wow. And I find that as teaching as well, as regular, more traditional teaching, each professional will have his or her own voice, and I think that this is true as well for online course, online content. Each one of us will have a slightly different angle. Yeah, there might be a general, common style, but again, the voice is very individual. Don't you think so?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's one of the beautiful things about education as a whole is that there's the opportunity to find somebody whose style is pleasant to you, right? One teacher you may go and you don't love that teacher's presentational style as much as another, but you can find teachers, and there's great opportunities there, and I love that about education.
So let's stick around a little bit longer in the educational space there. And you mentioned briefly that a few years ago you acquired a company. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Is that Thinkster?
Yeah, so that's Thinkster. Yeah, being one of the first authors at Pluralsight and being such a prolific author, I ended up making a fairly decent amount of extra money, and had a decent amount saved up about what you would spend on buying a house. And I really wanted to shift my focus because in the year or two before that, my daughter, she was at primary school, at high school, and she really wanted to be a programmer. And so I started learning and researching about the educational system here in the U.S. and in Western civilization, Western Europe, North America, et cetera. And I started discovering all these problems with the way that we educate our students as a whole. Both at primary school, the history of where that came from, and just education in general, started to understand more. And I became a researcher in education as a science. And as I was learning that really about my daughter was the goal there, I discovered that, I'm learning and seeing all these problems in these courses that I'm preparing for students, right? And I realized that what I was doing at Pluralsight was not very effective overall educationally.
What kinds of problems are you talking about?
So the simplest answer there is the difference between passive and active education. Online courses, which once you become a programmer and it's time to continue to skill up, you must skill up as a programmer. Programming is moving fast. And yes, you will find those programmers that have learned a good skill, and then just continue on doing that same thing for years and maybe even decades. But that is very rare. Programmers constantly are moving on to new technologies as new technologies are developed. And some areas of programming move slower than others. Front-end moves slower than others. Front-end development, for example, moves very fast as a whole. But you must be skilling up. And the place where you skill up as a programmer is not to go back to university. They don't offer these, they don't offer courses on FaunaDB that just came out last year, or Hotwire, the Rails people, their new technology. You have to learn this at other places, blogs and such. So all of these other avenues where you can get education, all these other avenues are passive. They are 100% passive, and the only place that they even attempt to be active. You can try to follow along, but in all cases, what they present to you is simply, here's how I did a thing, and I'm doing this thing, and you can see me do this thing. And there's this, I call this one of the great lies of education is download the code and type along with. There's an educational term called generation where you actually generate the answer, right? If I ask you what 2 plus 2 is, you have to generate the answer as 4. But if I tell you 2 plus 2 is 4 and then ask you what 2 plus 2 is, now that's just repetition or memorization, not generation. So all these places where you read blogs and read that how somebody did a thing, or you watch a video course where somebody says, download the code and type along with me. These are they're truly passive. The only active education going on is you're practicing your typing because you're trying to type what they type.
Okay.
But you're not actually solving a problem. And I wanted to do something different. So that's why I went over to Thinkster and tried to actually do things differently than what's mostly goes on. There are some rare exceptions to this. There are some rare exceptions where you're given an actual homework example or homework problem, but it's very rare.
Were you able to do something differently there?
Yeah, so the content that we produced, ultimately, I ended up working with a lot of authors and having other authors teaching them. I ended up working with a lot of authors and having other authors teaching them how to produce better content and utilizing. I hired a woman who has a master's degree in education, and her and I helped design curriculum and teach authors to produce very hands-on material. We did this very much front end. So if you happen to have been doing, anybody, whoever's listening, if you happen to have been doing some front end, you might have encountered tools like Code Sandbox, StackBlitz, CodePen, things like that, where it's a browser that you can actually code up some JavaScript and web frameworks. So we mostly utilize StackBlitz because we were also a very front-end oriented site. Angular, React, that type of thing was most of our content. So we could have our standard ideal was to have 1 or 2 videos that showed how to do something, and then a video that showed an exercise and explained, here's what I want you to do. I want you to do these 3 things, and at the bottom would be a link that would open up. I want you to do these 3 things, and at the bottom would be a link that would open up one of these StackBlitz projects. And because it's StackBlitz, it opens up in a few seconds. You click the link, and 3 seconds later, there's Angular or React running. And then you walk through the directions and do it. And then in the next video, the instructor then shows you how they did and solved the same problem. Because a lot of times in programming, there isn't just one right answer. There's many ways to solve the same problem. And so you can watch the instructor solve it their way and see how your way compares. And then you move on to the next topic. So we did a lot of that. And it was I really enjoyed the challenge of it and the product that we made.
It really sounds very hands-on and very different from the passive approach that is mostly used,
Yes. And I also feel a little bit, if you're familiar with the movie The Matrix, I feel a little bit like I had taken and I can't remember which color pill it is that.
The blue or red, yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I had taken that pill and now I had opened up my eyes and taken that pill and now I had opened up my eyes and seen the world. And now, of course, I constantly, as a programmer, continue to educate myself and learn new things, but I go and read blogs and such, and I wish that these were active educational environments and not so passive.
Are you still actively working with Thinkster at this point?
I work very little. I still do run Thinkster, but I mostly rely on the other authors now to produce the content there. And I've taken on a new challenge and a new position in just about 6 months ago. So now I've got kind of another focus in my life after Thinkster.
Sounds very obscure there. Are you able to open up and what is that new thing?
Of course,
or if not, that's okay.
Yeah, so Thinkster was really a great experience for me. But even though Thinkster itself did very well, I had to go back and get a job. So a friend of mine has been running a consultancy, just a typical consultancy, but he started a new project with this. He's running an Angular specific consultancy called Hero Devs, but they started a new product called XLTS because this is probably something most students that are learning would not have been exposed to. But the current version of Angular is a previous version called AngularJS, and Google is ending its support for that. And so our company offers to large, Fortune 500 type clients who have these older applications built in AngularJS and they can't get them rewritten in time. Google's going to end its support, so we offer support, extended support for that. So honestly, this is kind of funny, but nowadays I'm a salesman. Nowadays I sell this product to big client, Fortune 500 clients. And it's a very technical product. I have to have a lot of knowledge about the topic, but I'm a salesman nowadays.
It's what
And it's a very technical product. I have to have a lot of knowledge about the topic, but I'm a salesman nowadays.
it's called the sales engineer, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I'm a sales engineer. Hey, I have to know so much about. I've programmed many years in AngularJS, so that knowledge of AngularJS and what you do with those applications and how you move them, it's very important in this role. But yep, sales engineer. So yet another pathway forward is, I couldn't have just done this without that background of engineering and that experience of actually being a programmer. I wouldn't be effective at my job.
Joe, I want to quickly move to a segment that I called Pick One. I'm going to give you two options. You're going to pick one and tell me why. I'll have two of those, Angular or React.
Ooh, I'll pick Angular with the caveat that both are fantastic frameworks. The simple answer why is that I myself am much more comfortable and familiar with Angular. So when I choose to do my own projects, I choose Angular over React. One other compelling reason to choose Angular over React, and that is that it's definitely more built for robust enterprise type applications. But React is migrating and changing, and so that can change over time. But I'll pick Angular over React. But without saying that that's a strong preference, I'm actually very involved in the React community as well.
Reading a book or taking an online course?
That's a tough one. In general, I would say taking an online course is better. The richer media is going to be better. So I'll pick the online course, but that's a tough choice. I do love books, even programming books. I do love them.
Talk to me a little bit about the fact that you have been, and I don't know if you are still actively doing this, but an event organizer, a conference organizer. Can you tell me about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love organizing events. Absolutely. Yeah, I love organizing events. I started off by helping to organize a local meetup. Organized that for a while and kind of ended up being the head organizer at our local meetup. I even started up a couple of extra meetups that I stepped away from. And then one day I also helped with a small conference that was like an annual conference that the local JavaScript meetup was running. So I assisted with that for a couple of years, 5 or 10 people doing it. And I just was one of the people chipping in. And then one day, me and several other of my friends had this crazy idea to create an Angular conference when there was none. And we did that, and that was much bigger. Instead of 100 people at the local library, it was 700 people at a fancy hotel.
Wow.
And contracts for $500,000 that I had to sign my name to. So I was actually very lucky that it was very successful. And but I love the event organization job. It's absolutely one of the funnest jobs that you can do, because you work for a year and then for 1, 2, 3 days, there's hundreds of people in a space. Just they're learning, they're benefiting, they're connecting with each other, they're growing their career, and you can see all this activity going on, and you stand on the outside of it, and you know that you were the one who helped make that happen. It's very beautiful, and it's such a fun environment to be in. I mentioned that I did a lot of conference speaking. I started going to a lot of conferences, and especially JavaScript and Angular conferences. And I ended up creating a group of friends, 20 pretty close friends, but I only saw them at conferences. They lived all over the world, a lot in Europe and all over the US, and I organized the big Angular conference, React-conf. I organize that for Facebook. And we've tried and started up 4 or 5 other conferences that haven't necessarily gone well, and we're in the middle of starting up a brand new one, the Reliable Web Conference. So literally, whoever's listening to this will be the first time anybody's ever heard of this, and you'll be hearing about this before we even officially announce it to the world.
It's interesting to see someone so passionate about the process of putting also a conference together, because I assume that once you are done and the conference is done, you have to start already planning for the one next year, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's for the smaller conferences. Depending on the location, is a pretty big dictator of that. But for these big conferences, the big Angular conference now is 1,500 people. And for that, oftentimes we are planning 14 to 16 months ahead. And usually we are even to the hotel 2 or 3 years ahead of time.
Wow. Wow, wow. What is the biggest challenge putting together a conference?
Hmm, that's a good question. I think organization is the biggest challenge. We were really lucky that we hooked up with a company, a logistics company who handles the majority of the organization for us. So we just have to make the bigger decisions about content and, picking talks and stuff. But all the thousands of little pieces that have to be in place are handled by another company that handles those logistics.
I'd like to move on to another segment here that I call the fireside chats, Joe.
Okay.
And it's supposed to be quick questions with quick answers. And the first one is, what's your superpower?
I thought about this quite a bit. I knew that I had preparation for this, that you're going to ask this question. And I think that my superpower is actually testing.
It's an awesome power because a lot of what we do as coders,
And I think that my superpower is actually testing.
it's an awesome power because a lot of what we do as coders is about testing what we're doing, and it's so important, and I think it's so undervalued as well.
Yes. And it's nice to see those things. So many things change. But if you're familiar with Uncle Bob, and if anybody's listening, if you're not, you should definitely become familiar with him. Very smart individual. But he said something on a podcast I was on with him. It's the things that don't change that are the most important.
The flip side of that coin, what's your kryptonite?
Maybe patience. Because for me, one of the hardest things to deal with is things like bureaucracy when it's difficult to get things done. Which is interesting because, say, a conference, something that takes a year of work to really come to fruition, it seems like that takes a lot of patience. But that doesn't take patience so much as it takes diligence and just consistent effort. Patience is more about dealing with the problems while they're going on and lasting through them. And jobs that have a lot of bureaucracy, I have a difficult time with that, of being patient through those things. So maybe patience is my kryptonite.
Tell me about a time that things didn't work out as well as you were expecting.
Ooh, well, I could list several, but let me probably, I think the time that is most useful to talk about in my career was the time that I got fired from a job. That was definitely a change I wasn't expecting. I'd been at a company for 6 years or so. I was their central programmer. I'd written the vast majority of the code that existed at the company. They had a new manager, and I ended up getting fired. He scheduled an appointment with me one day at 4 and then told me to clean out my desk and get out. Desk and get out by the end of the day.
No reasons?
Oh, he had his reasons, but it didn't end up being because I had made any particularly big mistake. It was more about he just didn't like me and my style so much as a developer.
Wow.
So wasn't your typical reasons that you get fired, for lack of performance per se. But I think I was potentially a little bit too comfortable at the job, and so maybe I wasn't working as hard as I could have been. But it was a huge shock, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's what I was about to ask. How did you feel like?
It was very tough. It was absolutely tough. I felt very angry at him. I thought it was very much undeserved, and he was very rude and mean, honestly, when he fired me. He literally said, "We have a lot of big work coming up ahead, and we can only use top-notch people around here, so we're going to let you go." Here's a tip for you for everything that they've done. Let them know that it doesn't work out. It's not working out, and wish them the best of luck.
To be quite honest, even if if that's the reason, I mean, you don't necessarily need to do that, with the other person, no?
Right. For every person, somewhere there's a bus that person is the right person to sit in that seat on some seat on that bus, right? But it wasn't going well. It didn't go well for me after I was fired. I found another job, but it didn't pay quite as well, and it was a contract position, so I ended up not paying my taxes because I couldn't afford to pay the taxes because I'd taken a pay cut. And so instead of cutting down my expenses, I just didn't pay my taxes for a year or two, and that was very difficult. Fortunately, I didn't go to jail or anything like that. Turns out you don't really Normally go to jail for stuff like that. When you finally do file your taxes, you end up paying a lot in penalties.
Penalties, yeah, I get it. I
Yeah.
get it. So, okay, thank you for the honest answer there. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's your current challenge?
My current challenge is definitely adapting to this job of being a salesperson. So I'm throwing myself into learning how to be a good salesperson, how to meet with people and help them understand being a good type of salesperson, not the kind that tries to trick people into buying things, but instead helps them see how your product meets with their needs from a technical standpoint, and being organized in that way. That's, guess, my current challenge at the moment, is to do well at my current position.
Can you share a resource, Joe? It might be a book, a site, an author.
There's I thought about this for quite a while as well as what I would share, and I would say my favorite book to share with people is the book Test-Driven Development by Example by Kent Beck, and quite an older book, but for me, learning test-driven development was a major turning point in my career, and so and that's how I learned it, was by reading this book. So I would recommend Test-Driven Development. And that's how I learned it, was by reading this book. So I would recommend Test-Driven Development by Example, written by Kent Beck.
I see the theme of testing very frequently mentioned by you. Why is that?
Well, again, I think I learned test-driven development about 2005, but I learned unit testing several years before that, around 2001, 2002. And I liked unit testing, but once I learned test-driven development, I felt like, again, the world was opened up for me. I was able to solve harder problems than I could solve without test-driven development. And for me, that made such a huge impression on me, the ability to do better as a programmer. And I'd given myself, a bigger bat to swing with, so to say, or a better tool. And so that really had a striking effect on me. And it's universal applicability. This is test-driven development is something you can use in any language. Development is something you can use in any language, in any environment, etc. It's a thought process and an idea, and it's not some tool or technology, really.
Can you talk to me about a turning point in your career?
Yeah, so I mentioned that test-driven development, learning that was definitely important, but around 2008 or 2009, I decided to make a very so I'd been programming at this point 15 years. And I think I started to feel a little comfortable in what I was doing. I was a .NET developer at the time, building websites, and things were very cool, but I felt a little stagnant, and I just could sort of tell in myself that I needed a new challenge. And so I did not enjoy JavaScript. I didn't enjoy HTML and CSS per se. I liked the fact that the server-side rendered frameworks meant that I had to do very little of those things. And I said to myself, you know what? I'm going to just go entirely shift my career, pick a new technology, start from square one. And so I decided I was going to become a front-end developer. And I remember at the time, around 2009, I looked and found a new job that it looked like I was going to be able to be a front-end developer. It turned out all they wanted was somebody to manage a very complex CSS engine in their .NET application. And I quit that job, or I actually let them know. I said, this isn't the job that I thought I was going to have. This is different than I thought. And so I'm going to go and look for a new job. And if you decide, it's one of the nice things about being a programmer, and after a while you get fairly highly paid, is you have the luxury of knowing that if you do lose your job, it's relatively easy to find a replacement job. So you can be a little bit more cavalier, you might say, with your job. But I told them, I'm going to look for a new job because I want a job where I'm coding in JavaScript 70 to 80% of the day. And I remember my boss or my manager talked to me, and he said, do you even think that there are jobs like that? And I said, I think there are. And then I within a month or so, and there's so much more movement and fast pace in the front end world that I was able to become more of a community leader and thought leader and expert, and get involved in something like Angular, and then do the conference. And it really exploded my career quite a bit.
What would you do differently if you were starting again your career, but knowing what you know today?
I thought about this a lot, and I think that I honestly wouldn't change anything. As much as I could short circuit things, I also recognize that all the things that happened that were bad, or the mistakes that I made, were very important. They taught me a lot of really important things and led me on to the next piece. But no, I value that the mistakes that I made, the bad things that happened to me, that they always propelled me forward in a positive direction, even if at the moment it didn't seem that way. So honestly, I would say nothing.
Joe, we are coming towards the end here. Is there anything else that you'd like to squeeze in before we say our goodbyes?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I talk about this a lot in the places where I have opportunities to talk to people about having a career in development. And I think one story I love to tell people that I hope people listen to and learn from as developers is the story of my first development job and then the next year after that. So my very first development job, again, the guy handed me these books and I just started programming. And every night when we went home, I would take those Fox Pro books and I would go home and I would read them. And I had a computer at home, so I got to practice a little bit as well. And that's what I did every night. And we worked at a place that did data entry. So people were their jobs were to type in things. And as programmers, I think we were paid about $9 US dollars an hour. But the good data entry people, the people that were fast, they could make $13, $14, $15 an hour. And I had another developer that sat next to me that had another 2 years of experience more than I did. Every night he'd go home and he'd take some of these batches of data entry home because he could make extra money. I went home and I didn't get paid, but he went home and he got paid. So after a year, I think I left that job, and about 7 or 8 months later, my coworker, a year later, my coworker called me and said, "Hey, you should come and work at this company that I'm working at now." He had a new job as well. And he says, it's a great company to work for, come and work. And at the time, I think I was making $17 an hour, where I was making $9 just a year before. And I said, well, I'd be interested in going to that job if they were paying at least $19 an hour. And he said, "Whoa, $19 an hour, what are you making now?" And I said, 17. And he says, "Really? That's more than I make." And that was a very important lesson to me. The value of the things that you do that you don't get paid for. And so I think if there was one thing I could tell you, the value of the things that you do that you don't get paid for. And so I think if there was one thing I could tell people embarking upon practically any career, but certainly in programming, it's the things you don't get paid for that are the most valuable to you.
And you can see that reflect in so many ways with your participation in community and your contribution there. I mean, so many examples, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Joe, once again, thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for having done this, for letting me explore your origin stories, your career there. And you have so much to share and so much to contribute. And this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning. You're just starting, okay?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Aderson. I really had a great time.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And I hope that we can catch up in the near future to see how you're doing with your new position, okay?
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening.